Hi, my name is Michelle Skyme, and I'm going to talk to you about assumption and constraint analysis in risk analysis. Assumption can be defined as a supposition or something that is taken for granted, or a belief that has not been validated but is believed to be true regarding any aspect of a project. According to dictionary.com, a constraint is a limitation or restriction. Susan Weiss, a consultant and curriculum designer specializing in project management with a master's in project management from George Washington University, defines constraint as a fixed boundary or limit to what can be done. In an article entitled Identifying Project Assumptions and Constraints, she defines two types of constraints: business and technical. Business constraints are those that focus on time, money, and resources, while technical constraints involve the physical equipment such as hardware or software and other infrastructure. Assumption and constraint analysis is the process of creating documentation which will provide a consistent definition and interpretation of the project and the associated environment. This allows everyone on the project to have the same understanding of the situation and prevent miscommunications during the risk identification and analysis. Assumption and constraint analysis is used during project initiation and any time a change takes place in a project. Each time a change occurs, the assumptions and constraints should be reviewed to ensure that they all still hold true. They should also be reviewed when decisions are being made regarding the action to take to allow for informed decision making. The primary use of assumption and constraint analysis is risk identification. Some situations when risk identification should occur is during project selection, contract negotiations, or any types of meetings where resources or changes are being discussed. Assumption and constraint analysis are also used during risk qualification and risk quantification. In order to create a complete assumptions and constraint analysis, it is important to derive information from as many sources as possible, such as the project manager, the project team, the customer or customers, any available supporting documentation, the lessons learned from previous similar projects, or any research that was conducted specifically for the project. Outputs from the assumption and constraint analysis include documentation in the risk register. If you have access to project management software, they are often included in the notes field, or they can be written into the specifics on a memorandum of understanding signed by all parties involved. One important note is that the output needs to be documented in a consistent format to be useful. If the information is scattered or not documented in a way that it is retrievable and reviewable, it is ineffective. According to Terry Schmidt, a Harvard MBA and internationally renowned management consultant, there are 3 steps involved in the process of assumption and constraint analysis. The first step is to identify the assumptions and constraints. Some questions suggested include what conditions must exist and what must be true for this effort to work. How must the world cooperate with us? What else must happen for this to succeed? What else should we assume? And what else limits our ability to complete this work? The second step is to analyze and test the assumptions and constraints. Some questions suggested include: how important is this assumption to strategy success or failure? How valid or probable is this assumption? What are the odds and how do we know? If they fail, what is the impact? Is it diminished, delayed, destroyed? What could cause this not to be valid? And the third step is to act on them. Here is an example of an assumption and constraint analysis template. The first column contains the description of the assumption or constraint, Schmidt's Step 1. The next two columns contain questions that help to test and analyze the assumptions, Schmidt's Step 2. The last column is used to determine what is required in Schmidt's Step 3. If the previous two columns are both answered yes, then the assumption or constraint should be converted to a risk and acted upon appropriately. If one of the previous two columns is a no, then the assumption or constraint should be documented and reviewed when needed. Now I'm going to demonstrate how to use the assumption and constraint analysis template for a simple project. The project that I will use is making breakfast for my daughter. If I were to use the template to analyze the assumptions and constraints for this project, it would look something like this. First, I'm going to assume that we have cereal and milk, which is what she likes for breakfast. There is a possibility that we are out of milk or cereal. If there is no milk or cereal, it will affect my ability to make breakfast for her. Therefore, this should be converted to a risk and acted upon appropriately. Another assumption that I make is that my daughter will wake up on time. This could prove false because she sometimes oversleeps. If she does oversleep, it could affect the project. So again, this assumption should be considered a risk. One constraint for this project is that my daughter requires 20 minutes to eat her breakfast. This has never been proven false. It always takes 20 minutes. And if she did take less time to eat, it would not affect the project. Therefore, this does not need to be considered a risk. Another constraint is the need for bowls and spoons for the cereal. I know that we have bowls and spoons in the kitchen, so it cannot be proven false. If it did happen to be false and the bowls and spoons were not in the kitchen, it would affect the project. However, since the answer to the first question was no, this is not a risk either. There are some advantages and disadvantages to using the assumption and constraint analysis technique. Some of the advantages include that it generates a consistent understanding of the situation among all the project team members. The resources are generally available to complete the analysis, and it is quick to implement. Some of the disadvantages involve the level of accuracy and detail, which varies depending upon the project. A similar disadvantage is that the level of utility is relative to the accuracy and detail that is available. There are many other techniques for risk analysis that can be used instead of or along with assumption and constraint analysis. The expert interview technique, documentation review technique, and the brainstorming technique could all be considered part of the assumption and constraint analysis technique because they are all methods of gathering information about the project environment from various sources to identify as many assumptions and constraints as possible. Other techniques such as SWOT analysis and the Crawford-Slip method, like the assumption and constraint analysis technique, are relatively easy to use. They also do not require a lot of project management knowledge, unlike the Delphi technique, which requires special training. Determining which technique or techniques to use depends upon the scope of the project and the resources available. So in summary, assumption and constraint analysis should first occur during project initiation. It should be reviewed whenever changes to the project occur. It is important to get input from as many team members and experts as possible. And the technique is relatively easy to use, but it can be difficult to get complete and reliable results unless you are thorough during the process.